Thanks for tuning in to Poured Over, the Barnes & Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie. My guest today is a novelist, essayist, and critic whose work has appeared in The Guardian and the Irish Times. His most recent novel, The House on Vesper Sands, was listed as a best book of the year by The Guardian, The Observer, and the New York Times. This January, he's back with a sequel to that novel. It's entitled The Naming of the Birds. Please join me in welcoming Paraic O'Donnell. Paraic, how are you doing?
Hey, Chris. Great to be with you.
I appreciate you joining us today from your home in Ireland. There's a bit of a time difference, obviously, between the two of us, but I appreciate your flexibility and for getting to chat with you.
3 p.m. It's my morning.
I just finished reading my advanced copy of The Naming of the Birds a couple nights ago, and I have to say that it is a great gothic mystery blockbuster that is the perfect read for long, cold winter nights that we are currently experiencing. Keeping in mind that we're going to do our best to keep our conversation spoiler-free for the listener, Paraic, would you mind telling the listeners at home what The Naming of the Birds is all about?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I will try to steer clear of spoilers. We did have an editorial review come out with a, but yeah, so The Naming of the Birds, for those who didn't check out the first book, is a standalone sequel in what is now, I guess, a series that began with the House on Vesper Sands. It features Inspector Cutter and his accidental sidekick, if you will, a former Cambridge divinity student called Gideon Bliss, who, in that first book, arrived in London under confusing circumstances and inveigled his way into the services of the Metropolitan Police, all the way into a major investigation. And the second book resumes a year later and is, I guess, mystery fans will be relieved to hear, entirely independent of the first book. So you don't have to have read Vesper Sands, to enjoy this by any means, although there are, I guess, some Easter eggs in there and some fan service, you might call it, for the people who are familiar, but it is an entirely new story. It begins in what is the past for Cutter and Bliss. It begins 22 years before the then present, and it is the opening scenes take us to an unnamed institution in an unnamed part of England, and we meet a cast of young children who have recently been removed from a place they know only as the asylum under, I guess you'd say, opaque circumstances, and they've now been gathered for reasons they know nothing about in this bleak hallway, and in the opening scene they're being addressed by a man they know nothing about, who's clad in black robes, with the appearance of a stern schoolmaster, and who announces that they're to be given new names, that they're to be named after birds. And that is where the story begins for the children. The sequences that follow introduce you to a character who will, again, being mindful of spoilers, who obviously be significant in the later stages of the book, but I think what we can say is that she is pivotal and she is unique, and she will reappear in some capacity. But I think even her name, I think, is kind of verging on spoiler territory. So I'm being very, very circumspect. We relatively quickly return to the contemporary of the novel's world, which is 1894, where Cutter and Bliss are in the process of procuring firearms because the normally gruff and unflappable and garrulous Inspector Cutter, something's got under his skin, and he is very much out of sorts. And Bliss has been. Bliss is again, for readers who didn't meet them in the first book, Bliss is, as his background maybe suggests, he's a former divinity student. He's bookish. He is, unlike Cutter, who is, very solidly built and very physically commanding. Bliss is a kind of a wispy a wispy figure. Although he's very dogged and persistent and quite morally pure in his way. He's also got lots of mannerisms that are constantly irritating Cutter and inviting the sharp edge of Cutter's tongue. But they're buying weapons because Cutter is worried about something, and in the chapters that follow, we begin to see the shape of what it is that Cutter is worried about, and we begin to sense how it might be connected to the events that occurred in the past that I just mentioned. I hope that's not too opaque a general introduction.
No, I think that's great. I think that really sets the stage for the book. And there's a lot of things in there that I kind of wanted to ask you about and kind of unpack a little bit. So I think my first question was, and I think you had kind of not necessarily surprised, but kind of you saying that, like, well, I guess it's sort of a series now, kind of ties into my first question, which was, what was the development of the story like for you in relation to The House on Vesper Sands? Because I know that book came out in 2021, so I imagine you were working on that for a couple of years before then. This, we're obviously a few years after 2021. Was The Naming of the Birds a story and a narrative that you had thought of while you were working on Vesper Sands, or did you need time away from the characters before you realized how you wanted to return to them?
It's a really interesting question, because I, in fact, did come up with the germ of another story set in the same world while I was writing Vesper Sands. And in fact, I began writing it much earlier than I should have, because I was still on a deadline for the first book, but it didn't work out. I got 3 chapters in, and it just didn't work out for various reasons. And I guess the truthful answer is no. It happened much later, and it was a very candidly, it was a very difficult process, because the production of there was a long gap between these 2 books. So Vesper Sands came out first in the UK in 2018, and obviously it's almost 2025 now, so it's quite a long interregnum, and there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is my congenital laziness, full disclosure. But I do also live with a long-term illness, which limits my mobility and limits my life in many ways. I was listening while I was preparing for this interview to your discussion with the great Susanna Clarke, who I revere beyond all reason. And without trespassing on Susanna's privacy, I know that she has spoken at least a little publicly about her own struggles in and her own long interregnum. So that played into it as well. There were personal difficulties, but also for me, when it comes to questions about process, there just isn't one. I have to wait. I'm one of those people who needs the germ of everything. For me, is always an inciting image, a single image that becomes indelible. So with Vesper Sands, that inciting image was the image of the seamstress Esther Tull, who, for reasons that we can't yet know, climbs mournfully to the top floor of a house in Mayfair and makes her way to a precipice and hurls herself onto the street below with a message stitched into her own skin. That was the inciting event, the inciting image, rather, in the case of Vesper Sands. And I needed one for the next book, and it didn't come. Well, the wrong inciting image came. And so, I spent some time, I guess, pursuing that rabbit hole. And it was some time before the right one came. And when it came, it was the image that I've just described to you in the opening scenes of the book. And The Naming of the Birds has been, very extensively edited, as all books should be, because that's the one golden rule. But the opening sequence is, as it stands, almost untouched from that inciting image, and that's actually quite typical. That has been true for all 3 books so far.
Was the part of the challenge of writing The Name of the Birds as a sequel of sorts, was some of that challenge, were you more kind of cautious or maybe feeling like you had to be a little bit more thoughtful with this being a sequel versus the like first? I mean, it is, as we were saying, it is a standalone book. You can read it without having read the previous one, and you can follow along just fine. But was there more pressure? Did you feel more pressure because it was a sequel versus a original book? Like, you have all of this stuff coming out of the first book that you had to sort of work with a little bit, and I guess it kind of sort of confined with a little bit necessarily because you've set those parameters in the first book.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think it contains several questions. So there are, operating at different levels. First of all, you have the kind of boring contractual pressure. So you're in a different arrangement when you're writing a sequel, and so that imposes certain kind of procedural strictures, and that's all as it should be. This is a job at the end of the day, and publishing is a business, so that's all fine. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It does impose new disciplines on you that you don't necessarily think about when you're writing a standalone, and when you wander, as I did, into writing a series more or less by mistake. And so one of the things I found myself thinking about, for example, was, I'm not just managing an arc over the course of a story this time out. I'm managing an arc potentially, over the course of a career, if you like. So over the course of a career in fiction. So, it may be, and who knows, obviously, we're all at the mercy of the readers, your listeners to this podcast, we're at the mercy of their good graces. So we can't assume anything, but, best case scenario, there may be 3 books, there may be 5 books, who knows? And you're going to have to sustain not just the reader's attention, but you're also going to have to gratify them and satisfy their sense of growth and development, and also proportion. Because one of the things that changes over the timeline of a series as distinct from a standalone novel is that sense of the proportion of events and where they stand in time in relation to each other. It's a similar kind of phenomenon to what you see in other genre fiction. You see it in speculative fiction, you see it in science fiction, you see it in high fantasy. All kinds of genres, have these challenges, and they're all concerned with managing kind of large organizational structures. It's not to sound too kind of highfalutin about it, but you do have more kind of administrative overhead to manage when you're working on a series. And I actually, some of it was challenging, but I really found some of that fascinating, and it gave me, I guess, an appreciation. And I'm never short of appreciation for, because one of my kind of hobby horses is, I'm kind of passionately small c Catholic, about genres and the kinds of stuff that I read, because I was formed, my reading at a very young age was kind of disgracefully eclectic, because I was reading all the things that you're supposed to read at that age. I was reading Huck Finn, and I was reading my English classics and my Jane Eyre and all those things, but I was also reading my mum's Jackie Collins and, my mum's Shirley Conran, and, reading stuff about, illicit goings on Onyx boardroom tables. And I think that kind of literary formation is something I personally treasure, because I think, apart from anything else, it gives you an appreciation for, just the wonderful and dizzying range of possibility, the range registers, the range of, modes and registers of language in which you can have fun, because that's so much a part of it. Ultimately, that's so much a part of when I'm writing, and when everything is working, okay, on the good days, on the great days, and I won't pretend that they're all great days, but when when, all cylinders are firing, what it's about for me is finding a way to delight people while also delighting myself. I think that's, people ask a lot, about managing, because the books are, one of the things that people remark on about the books is that they are full of humor. They're full of darkness. And, I hope I'm right in saying that they're unafraid to approach darkness, but they're also full of levity, and they're full of small joys and small moments of intimacy and wit, and sometimes caustic wit. But, they're full of levity as well, because that is my experience of life, and that is my experience of, that to me is what it means to be faithful and truthful to our experience. We are all enduring right now quite dark and trying times. We're all, I think, without veering, into contentious territory, we're all a little bit maybe on edge these days, perhaps more in need of comfort and more in need of assurance than we might normally be. And I think, I'd look, no one writer is going to be a salve for the national soul, right? But I think we can all do our part in just, on the one hand, being true to our experience of the world, being, bearing adequate witness to, and this is one of the things that I tried to do in the book. It's set in 1894, but the areas that it gets into, again, being conscious of spoilers, but it gets into, the care, the care and the care of children, and the dereliction of our duty to children, in the most disgraceful and upsetting ways. All of these themes are approached, I hope, with fitting dignity in the book, and in a way that isn't excessive or gratuitous, but that also kind of, as I say, like, bears adequate witness to those truths about the world, while also being truthful to how people like these detectives and the journalist Octavia Hillingdon, who is also vital to their shared mission, how people like that negotiate with those realities in their lives. People like, not necessarily detectives and journalists, but the people whose sense of ordinary duty and honor actually is needed to respond to events like that, bearing witness to that, because I'm kind of old-fashioned in that way. I'm sort of aligned with Tolkien in strongly believing that when change for the better does occur in the world, it occurs as the result of small kindnesses and small acts of moral duty by people who go unsung. I do strongly believe that, and I try to be kind of true to that without being cloying or without being sort of homiletic, if that makes sense.
I think you teed me up for the next thing I wanted to discuss really well, which was, in fact, the use of humor in the story, because I admittedly had not read Vesper Sands, so this was my first entry into your writing. And as you said a little bit at the top of the episode, the opening of the book, the kind of prologue of the book, is very heavy, dark. It's about these kids who are orphaned and in this bad situation. So I was like, wow, this book's probably going to be really heavy. It's probably going to be pretty dark. Okay. But then a few chapters in, I am finding myself like actually laughing out loud to the book, which I, to be frank, is not an experience that I often have with a book.
That's very kind.
But there was a joke, I think it was an exchange between Bliss and Octavia, that I was like, this is so funny. And so I was trying to think of, I was like, it's incredible that, and
is
I think
it
it's a testament.
Risque joke, Chris? Is it the slightly risque joke that I sneaked in?
It might have been, yeah, because I think it caught me like totally off guard, where in my mind I was like, you could make a joke here, and then I think you sort of made the joke that I was hoping that you would make, and I was delighted. So I really appreciated that. But what struck me was that to your point of like what you were saying, it's very difficult, and it can kind of be a tricky combination to balance those two tones of dealing with the darker side of life and the human experience, with also kind of the wit and humor that is also found in it, without necessarily coming across as glib or inappropriate or distasteful or anything like that. So do you have a process for kind of managing those two tones? Like, will you write a passage and maybe feel like the balance is off, so you have to deliberately adjust it, or do you just kind of leave it the way that you initially kind of wrote it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it involves a level of introspection that is difficult, because you almost become a machine trying to examine its own workings. But I think there are two processes involved. I think the first process is almost a technical one. So it's the process of simply trying to be as perfectly felicitous as you can, both at a superficial level, for example, to things like diction, the way that people would speak. And by the way that people would speak, I mean not just what's correct for the period, but also the rhythms of speech and the small inflections and hesitations and elisions that characterize real human interactions, and the movements, the small subtle movements and inflections of the body that form that they're so vital to the rhythms of personal interaction. So it's partly being true to that, because humor is so vital to that. It's so central. It's essential as storytelling itself, I think, to the human condition and to the human experience. And I think that's why we are so, when we encounter something like psychopathy, and you hear this discussed all the time in coverage of that subject, and with expertise that I don't possess, obviously. But one of the things, obviously, that's often been observed about psychopaths is that they lack that faculty, because that faculty, empathy, is central to the kinds of humor that succeed most universally. Empathy is central to that. It's a kind of subversion of empathy. And I think so it's partly that. It's partly being true to human experience, because that is what people do when they are trying to cope with these difficult situations. That is what most well-adjusted people do. Not everybody uses humor as a stress response. I'm not suggesting that, or that everybody should, or that it's the only correct way. But I'm saying it's very often the case that people, especially in professions, I have friends and relatives, for example, who are in the medical profession, and I know that they are very often extremely, dark in the way that they discuss their work, because they have to be. They have to. They are not without empathy. They are, these are deeply caring individuals, but they are required to operate at a different level in order to function effectively in their role. So humor is part of that, but also, I think, to get back to your duty to the reader and what I was saying earlier about trying to delight people while also delighting myself, the way I got started in this business, my origin story, if you like, was that I just tweeted out sort of microfiction, because I always approached any written medium that I came to as if it were a literary medium, just because, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you experiment and see what was possible with every form? So I one of the things that teaches you is it's almost like busking on the street. So so here in Dublin, we have a central thoroughfare called Grafton Street. It's kind of like what's it comparable to? It's as central as Times Square is, obviously on a much tinier scale. And on Grafton Street, especially at this time of year, the street is full of buskers, and some of them are highly accomplished musicians technically, but the stakes are very high. because you are trying to capture and retain people's attention, against all this competition. And I had all that training from Twitter about that balance. So that's honestly, it might sound crazy, but that's one of the answers to your question is, part of my training in how to maintain that balance in tone came from being extremely online, which I have to confess. And maybe some good came of it. Maybe it's a discipline. Maybe we could teach it.
I think also something that struck me, and I have, I guess, a pre-question to what will eventually be my question, but as you were just mentioning, like you just mentioned Dublin now, I know that you live in Ireland currently. Were you raised in Ireland or were you raised in England?
I think I know why you're asking. And it's a really, really, it's a richly interesting question. So I was born and raised here, very much so. I was born in Dublin, and Wicklow, where I live, is just outside Dublin. It's effectively a suburb. It's like the Virginia suburbs and DC. It's that kind of conurbation. So yeah, I was born and raised here, but I think one of the things that maybe one of the subtleties that maybe isn't well appreciated for folks in the US, because why would it be? Irish people are utterly steeped in English culture from a very early age. I grew up in the dark days of the 80s, and we had 4 TV channels. 3 of them came from the UK. So, you were very much steeped in the spoken language. And then at school, of course, our curriculum was kind of was kind of straddling this uneasy divide, because there were all these sort of cultural and historical developments going on. Between the great tradition, as F.R. Leavis put it, back when he was admissible, the great tradition, you were steeped in the great tradition from the time you were, in what you would call grade school. And then, I went on to university, as many hacks do, to study English lit. And there I was obviously immersed in the canon and all the rest of it. So you're kind of swimming in that sea from a really early age. And I guess also one of the things that I was doing, maybe consciously or unconsciously, was maybe at some level obey some kind of post-colonial impulse to recolonize the language and to assert a kind of ownership of the language, because not to be controversial. I mean, it's important to say, just as I've said that we grow up steeped in British culture, we are deeply, deeply, inextricably linked, the two cultures, in ways that also are underappreciated. People hear about conflict and they hear about, but that has a very, very, very minor presence in the daily lives of people who have shared existences and family and friends, and we are deeply intermingled. And all of that language, all of that tradition, and all of those possibilities in terms of diction and register and everything else, and playing with form and allusion and making reference to Conan Doyle and Wilkie Collins and everything right back to Beowulf. All of that is available to you, as well as my own native registers. So, why would I not make use of it all? That's my kind of strong position. And I guess, I know why it seems weird to, to people who are more familiar with Irish writers, hewing closely to and doing amazing work in the kind of the vernacular modes. Like Claire Keegan, for example, has the wonderful book out at the moment, Small Things Like These. I saw her meeting with Oprah the other day. It was wonderful to see that book reaching such a wide audience, because it is covering similar themes, and themes that I was deeply conscious of and deeply aware of while I was writing The Naming of the Birds. Those stories that Claire covers in that book are deeply familiar to me. But I was approaching those questions, I guess, maybe in a refracted way via the neighboring culture. But they're the same themes, and all of those kind of modes of getting the story out are available and valid, I think.
Looking at your author bio, I knew that you know, had some connection to Ireland. So maybe that was sort of, influencing my thinking a little bit. But when I was reading the book, the thought that I kept having sort of was that, going back to that point about, the humor juxtapositioned against the darker side of things, that I was like, this book feels quintessentially Irish to me, because this
Really?
feels like I'm only a American man who has spent 10 days in Ireland, but I have a deep appreciation, I think, for the culture and music and certain parts of it. So it did not strike me as surprising, but I was like, this feels like a book that could only be written by an Irish person, because of that masterful balance between the humor and the darker side of things. But also, I couldn't help but feel like there was, in the way that you write about Victorian era England, also sort of, in my perspective, felt like an Irishman's rendering of that time period, because there seems to be this distrust of and challenging of British institutions and the establishment there, in a way that, not to say that a British author would not write that way, but it seems to me that there was a very fundamentally Irish skew to it a little bit that may not be the case in other works.
Yeah, I absolutely see how you got there, and I think it's absolutely a valid insight, and I suppose it is one, most of what I do is unconscious, and I have to go and sort of make up.
Yep.
I have to account for it after the fact,
Yeah.
and make kind of satisfying sort of back-formed explanations. But I think that is one area where I do operate sort of semi-consciously while I'm working, which is that my politics obviously have been shaped, as everyone's have, by their personal milieu and by their their personal and family histories. My family in Ireland is typical in the sense that my maternal grandmother was an Irish Anglican stock. She was a St. John, spelt St. John but pronounced St. John in the Anglican style. My on my father's side, it was a Catholic family with people in high-ranking clergy. That kind of plurality of tradition is much more typical than people suppose. But I do have that kind of residual, that deep and ineradicable residual distrust of empire. I suppose a healthy contempt for the grandiosity of empire and the trappings of empire, some of which are still in evidence. So yeah, I mean, that is, I guess, one area in which I am somewhat overt in my politics. But I don't think in the year of our Lord 2024, as you said yourself, I don't think even there are many British writers who would find that problematic or objectionable. I think it's a reasonably central take at this point.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't exactly be controversial now, but I did sense that there was this kind of, in a way that, obviously it's, the Sherlock Holmes stories are their own thing, and Arthur Conan Doyle is his own thing. But I think that this very much felt like there was that underlying sense of irreverence to it. That really struck me as,
relatedly, I think, as well. One of the things that I wanted to do, which feels kind of closely allied to that, is point out that all those distressing stories that came out of Ireland that I mentioned earlier, that Claire Keegan animates so movingly in her book. All of those stories have now become indelibly linked in the public mind with Catholic tyranny, and rightly so. That period was intensely and disgracefully dark, and during that period, the Irish state abdicated its duty in a way that is unforgivable and has never been adequately atoned for. All of that is true. But it is also the case that the British Empire encompassed a great deal of institutional cruelty on a scale that is, I think, underappreciated. And while it is certainly true that the Victorians writ large, and I'm very wary of using the Victorians writ large, but there was a lot of genuine and well motivated philanthropy going on in that period. But there was also the Victorians were it's truism, but they were modern in many ways that we would find familiar. And one of the things they invented was outsourcing, and they outsourced a lot of this activity. A lot of this philanthropy was outsourced, and there wasn't a great deal of there were all kinds of boards and committees and well-meaning busybodies, but there was also a great deal of latitude, and it was also occurring at such vast and industrial scale that abuses were in many ways almost inevitable, and that those abuses were not, the form and nature of those abuses were linked to their time and place in exactly the same way as the Irish cases that we've discussed. In other words, they were outgrowths of empire and its vanities in exactly the same way as the Irish atrocities were outgrowths of Catholicism and its tyranny.
Thinking about all of that and thinking about the kind of how everything sort of ties together, and I guess maybe part of what was standing out to me, I think, like we were saying, like the humor plays into it, the irreverence, I think also, and I think I don't really think this is necessarily a spoiler in any way, but I do think that you kind of exit the book with a sense, it seems to me that there's always like a kernel of hope at the end, like sort of at the end of the book, in a way that, not going to go into detail about it necessarily, but I think that also strikes me as kind of something that is really essentially Irish, is that after all of this darkness and stuff, there's always that kind of little tiny indelible kernel of hope that's still there, which is what allows you to find the humor moving forward in whatever other darkness or storms are ahead. Is that kind of sense of there's reason to have faith in humanity, even though there's so many arguments to the contrary. There is, at the end of the day, still that kind of little bright spot. At least that was my interpretation, at least.
Yeah, and I don't think that's dangerous territory at all. That isn't a spoiler. We're not really giving anything away at all about how the book ends, because it would be far too labyrinthine. Yeah, but I did something similar at the end of Vesper Sans. It's almost like the people talk about the French exit. When you're leaving a party.
Mm-hmm.
And the Irish exit is similar. Our preference as a culture is when you're leaving, you kind of just dissipate like rain. You don't make a fuss. You don't go around double kissing the host. You kind of fade like a memory, and I think that's an accepted practice, and I think that kind of fading out at the end of the book, and that allowing of glimmering of something is kind of necessary, because none of us get to do happy endings in the classical way, and you have to give the reader something. You can't send them home dancing, but you have to give them something.
So I do want to talk about sort of, because we have these three main characters. We have Cutter and Bliss and Octavia, all of whom I should say are really three-dimensional, really well-rendered, feel very lifelike, and they each all have very distinct voices. So I was sort of wondering if there was one of their voices in particular that you really enjoyed writing in, and which one of them maybe you felt like you relate to the most in your actual day-to-day life.
Oh, picking favorites. That's really tricky. Um, I will say this: Cutter is, for reasons that maybe you picked up on. Like, Cutter is by far the most fun to write,
Right. Mhm.
because he gets, again, he's one of the things that always try to do, that I've always tried to do, I think, from the outset in my writing, is to see what potential there is to sort of really breathe new life into stock figures, almost to dare myself um, to see if it's possible to make a success of, what figures that are kind of dangerously close to central casting, if that makes
Mm.
sense. To see if I can, pull that off, to set myself kind of a challenge. And I guess there are elements of that to Cutter in his gruffness, and in the dynamic of his relationship with Bliss, because that dynamic has very often obviously been done in many forms. And I wanted to play with it, and I hope, and it's very kind of you to say that their voices are distinct and are feel living to you, because that's obviously what I'm striving for. So I guess the answer to your question is that Cutter is by far the most fun to write. But this may be hackneyed, but all of them are me, that do me, sort of dithering, almost adolescent, Gideon Bliss. That is an aspect of me, that who's forever sort of fretting over minor details of obscure textual questions. That is me, but I am also, Cutter is also an aspect of me. I guess my in my more impatient moments, and in my in my not suffering fools gladly moments. And I guess Octavia is my aspirations. Octavia is my version of, this is the future liberals want. Octavia is what I want for the is what I want for the world. She's the character I wouldn't be embarrassed for my children to read, and I hope that's doing her justice, because she is deeply complicated in her own way, and she is not just a banner waver, or a or a trope. She is very human, and as she reminds Gideon, at one point, she is very much a living, breathing, sweating, striving being, and I hope I was true to that too.
Yeah, she was. I really enjoyed all the characters, and I really loved the kind of dynamic, and like we've been saying about this kind of comedic aspect to it, where it very much feels like this kind of classic comedy dynamic, or there's that character driven humor, which I think is really impressive, and always a very high form of humor to be able to pull off when you're able to just kind of step aside and let the characters be themselves and have the humor derived from those exchanges. I think is really impressive. We are recording this episode comes out in January. The book comes out in January. We're recording this episode a little bit ahead of time, so it's a little bit around Christmas time right now. So as a more fun, festive question, I know we've talked a lot about the darkness and very things like that, but I was kind of curious to hear,
yeah, it would be
when
good.
this episode comes out, it will be after Christmas.
Okay.
But in your mind, what did each of the three main characters just receive for Christmas, and how did they feel about it?
Oh, okay. Let me think. Octavia she is a journalist by profession and an archivist by inclination and by passion. So it would have to be a rare manuscript in Octavia's case. Let's have her locate vital evidence that finally solves the mystery of the princes in the tower. I think that would be a nice Christmas present for Octavia. Gideon Bliss is an impoverished student still. He lives like an impoverished student, even though he's now gainfully employed. So Gideon needs new shoes perennially. Gideon always needs new shoes. His shoes are constantly flapping open, and he's constantly having to attend to them at inconvenient moments and attracting Cutter's wrath. So I would buy him, I think, a stout pair of brogues. Inspector Cutter is very difficult because it's not that he's the man who has everything, so much as the man who isn't interested in anything except, collaring, whoever was at the business end of the knife or the gun in question. But I think if I were pushed, I might try to persuade him to change his brand of cordial from peppermint. I think Cutter needs to switch it up a little bit. He has his favorite nook in Leggett's Fine Wines and Viands, which is the pub where he holds court, even though he has offices at Scotland Yard. That's where he does his business. And his Cutter is teetotal and quite vocal about it. I think he might need to switch it up a bit. And maybe even try slipping him some creme de menthe, see if we can't, get him to party a little bit.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the next book in the potential trilogy or series maybe it's set at Christmas time based off of, it seems like we already have a kernel of an idea going here. It seems like it's a pretty rich vein for you.
Yeah, I won't go so far as to commit to a very Cutter Christmas, but I won't rule anything out. There's a lot of visual richness that's available. The last book, Vesper Sands, was set in the snow, and that there's a lot of rich potential there in terms of aesthetics, and I'm nothing if not transparent and superficial. So who knows? Let's not commit to the project until maybe I get some Muppets on board.
Sounds good. Jokes aside, though, I know, and you had kind of mentioned it earlier while in our chat. Do you envision this being? I know it's probably dependent on the response from readers and staying in their good graces, but for these characters, do you view them as part of a trilogy? Do you think it's a longer series? What do you, in your mind, how do you see it playing out?
I'm going to give the boring stock answer, I'm afraid, and I'm going to say that it is in the lap of the gods. But I will say that I would be more than willing to return to this particular well if people want me to. And there will be at least one more, I can tell you that much. And beyond that, we'll see. I think I would be very keen to ensure that, if it does become a series, that it doesn't, that its lifetime feels natural and, follows a kind of natural arc and doesn't, overextend itself. I don't want to get into shark jumping territory. I don't want to be, season 8 of The Simpsons. I want to be doing something that is still that is still somewhat subversive, because again, without sounding too grandiose, I do want these things to succeed as kind of as high quality works of fiction, as well as functional pieces of entertainment in their genres. So I do have those ambitions for these books as well, and it may be that I need to turn to other kind of forms and mediums and worlds and possibilities to make that happen. But yeah, I'd be happy to return.
And of course, The Naming of the Birds is out now. But in terms of the rest of 2025, is there anything else that readers, listeners should be on the lookout for from you coming forward? Anything else big happening this year?
Well, yeah, readers need to tell me to get offline, because a disaster has happened. I mean, all my friends from Twitter have showed up on Blue Sky, and it's great. We're it's like the band is back together, and I'm just having a great time. Catching up with everybody, all their news, and having a wonderful time seeing everybody's launches and everybody's reviews coming out. And it's been so wonderful, because all of us who were extremely online on Twitter back in the day, we lost something. And personally, I'm not ashamed to say that I grieved over it a little bit, because I made real and true and lasting friends, and had really, really precious experiences on that platform. And, it was so great just to see everyone again. So what I would ask people is just if they see me online, after, say, February, March, tell me to get my ass back in the chair and get this done, because it's a danger. I need to watch that.
Well, until, so we'll give them a couple of months, but for listeners who want to follow you on social media and maybe connect on that platform, what would be the social handles for that?
Oh, it's just my name. Just my name.
Okay.
It's fully spelled out, no underscores, no spaces, nothing fancy. So it makes me easy to find.
The one and only Paraic O'Donnell is how you will find him on social media.
I wouldn't inflict that name on anybody else. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Paraic, you've been incredibly generous with your time and your thoughts and your imagination. So I really appreciate it. I think we're just about out of time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Paraic's new book, again, is The Naming of the Birds. It's available now at your local Barnes & Noble store and also online at bn.com. If you enjoy atmospheric Victorian-era mysteries that are dark and brooding, but also witty and action-packed, you're not going to want to miss this one. Like I was saying earlier, these characters are a lot of fun, and their world is fascinating to visit. If you live in somewhere where the winter is going to be cold and dark and wet, like Ireland or Victorian-era England, I highly recommend picking up a copy to keep you company. Paraic, thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Chris.
All right. Take care, and I hope you have a great year ahead.
You too.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of The Naming of the Birds. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by one of my favorite book buddies. I've got Donald out into the Detroit area. Donald, how are you today?
I am great, and so glad to be into 2025 and a new year of book recs.
100% yes. I'm going to go ahead and have you kick things off. You've got a really fantastic book to recommend, and I can't wait for people to hear about this. So jump on in.
All right. So, Naming of the Birds, there, like always, there's so many different books I could have recommended, but I really wanted to think about something that really could connect to the interestingness of the main character in Naming of the Birds, like that, just their profession, the things that they do. And one book kept jumping out at me, and that is Things in Jars by Jess Kidd. This book is absolutely bonkers, historical mystery that I can't stop putting in people's hands, right? We're talking about a extraordinary detective in late 1800s London. Her name is Bridie Devine, and she's trying to unravel the mystery of a kidnapping of Christabel Berwick, right? So it sounds very conventional, everyday mystery, and yet then it is insane. There's nothing that this story doesn't try to tackle, but it's a quick read. It's fun. You're going to walk away going, whoo, like this. And one of the really fun things about that is it also has something that I think even like younger teen readers would like, right? That supernatural child that's in the story. This sense of place and identity and how you fit into the world no matter what time in our history it lands in. So the mystery almost becomes secondary. Like you get so pulled into just the drama of these characters and everything they're going through and how Devine figures everything out. By the time you get to the end, you're like, oh, that's right, there's a mystery in here, and oh my gosh, that's how it ends? Like, it's a very shocking, interesting, aha ending as well. So, you'll walk by a shelf and you'll see this and go, all right, whatever. No, you got to read the back, and you're going to love everything about this book. So again, that's Things in Jars by Jess Kidd. Mark, what do you have to recommend for us this month?
Yes, that book is so weird and good, and I loved it. Good call. So first off, I am really excited for folks to be jumping into The Naming of the Birds. I think O'Donnell is a solid mystery writer. House and Vesper Sands was so fantastic. So I'm really excited for folks to get their hands on this new one. But if you want to keep up with the mystery winter, I would highly recommend grabbing Case Histories by Kate Atkinson. This is the first in the Jackson Brodie series and follows a former inspector who now works as a PI, and he in this book is unearthing some connections between three very separate mysteries. Brody is a very fun character to read. He starts out with this first in the series in a bit of a slump. His marriage has ended. His PI job is sort of satisfying, but a bit meh in comparison to his investigator job. He's got a lot going on. And he then gets tangled up in three very seemingly unrelated cases that span decades. And as he spelunks into each one of these cases, he really finds connections that really rattle him and everything that he thought he knew, not just about these particular cases, missing persons, murders, but about himself and what he's willing to dive into to get these things solved. Atkinson is a very skilled writer. She's got a very impressive body of work, and she really runs the gamut genre-wise. I think whatever genre she tackles, be it mystery, historical fiction, magical realism, short stories, her talent has always been pointed at the characters. She really takes great care to give these people life. And in case histories, I also think that the main character, the side characters, the neighborhoods and worlds these characters inhabit really just have a humility that I think works really, really well for a detective story. It's very grounded. It feels very honest. And that's just something that I think Kate can do without trying very hard. So please pick up Case Histories by Kate Atkinson. But guess what? That's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. We have a wonderful lineup coming in the next few months, so please stay tuned. You can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
At BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.